Well, good evening and a very warm welcome on behalf of Milim to this evening's presentation. Welcome to you wherever you are in the UK and wherever you are in the world. This evening, our series of online talks and conversations continues with our guests Elizabeth Barry-White and Joanna Sliwa, and I'll introduce both of our guests in just a moment after some brief housekeeping. Please do ask questions. It's easy to do this by typing whatever you would like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen. And as ever, we'll do our best to get through as many of your questions as we can. You'll also notice you've got a chat button, and that will allow you to send a message to all of the other participants on this webinar, should you wish to do so. Finally, we are recording this event and you'll find it in the next couple of days on our website at milim.org.uk. There you will find details of our future programme as well as past events recorded and the ability to book tickets for anything you'd like to see in the future. And so to our guests. Dr. Elizabeth Barry-White recently retired from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, where she served as historian and as research director for the Museum Center for the Prevention of Genocide. Prior to this, Barry spent a career at the US Department of Justice, working on investigations and prosecutions of Nazi criminals and other violators of human rights. She served as deputy director and chief historian of the Office of Special Investigations and as deputy chief and chief historian of the Human Rights and Special Prosecutions section. She lives in Fall Church, Virginia, where she joins us from. Dr. Joanna Sliwa is a historian at the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany in New York, otherwise known as the Claims Conference, where she also administers academic programs. She previously worked at the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee and at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. She has taught Holocaust and Jewish history at Kean University and at Rutgers University, and has served as a historical consultant and researcher, including for the PBS film In the Name of Their Mothers, The Story of Irina Sendler. Her first book, Jewish Childhood in Krakow, a microhistory of the Holocaust, won the 2020 Ernst Frankl Prize, awarded by the Wiener Holocaust Library. Joanna joins us from New Jersey, where she lives. The two are co-authors of this, The Counterfeit Princess, the Jewish woman who rescued thousands of Poles during the Holocaust. And that, my friends, is what they will be speaking to us about this evening. So a very warm welcome to you both. We're looking forward to hearing what you have to say, following which I very much hope our audience will ask you lots of questions. So without further ado, let me hand over to you.
Good evening. Thanks to Jonathan for the introduction, and thanks to all of you for joining us. We're very appreciative of Milim for giving us this opportunity to talk to you about the amazing and inspiring life of Janina Mehlberg. She clearly ought to rank among the greatest heroines of World War II, but it is only this year that her story is being told for the first time. I first learned of her in 1989 when, out of the blue, I was given a copy of her unpublished memoir. As I read it, my jaw dropped and continued dropping. Janina Mehlberg claimed that she survived the Holocaust in German-occupied Poland under the false identity of a Polish Christian aristocrat, the Countess Suchodolska. Using this guise, she became an official of a Polish relief organization in the city of Lublin. In this map, you can see that Lublin was in the part of German-occupied Poland that was called the General Government. It was both a city and a district. Thanks to her fluent German and her aristocratic status, the Countess was assigned to negotiate with Nazi and SS officials in Lublin for measures to aid Poles. From her memoir, it seems she was stubbornly persistent in her negotiations. never accepting no as a final answer, even going over people's heads until she finally got someone to tell her yes. And then she considered that an invitation to ask for even more. One focus of her work was providing aid to prisoners at Majdanek. This was a Nazi concentration camp, as you can see, it was on the edge of the city of Lublin. She continually badgered the SS to allow her organization to deliver ever greater quantities of food and supplies for prisoners at Majdanek. She got to the point where her organization was sending in tons of bread and hundreds of gallons of soup for thousands of prisoners 5 days a week. This didn't happen at any other concentration camp. She even got permission to deliver decorated Christmas trees and Easter eggs. She made these deliveries herself and persuaded the SS to let her bring them inside the camp, all the way up to the gate of each one of the prisoner compounds that you see marked here as fields. Once she obtained that access, she used her deliveries as cover to smuggle correspondence with resistance members imprisoned in the camp, because she was also an officer in the home army of the Polish resistance. She didn't just smuggle messages either. She snuck in everything from books to medical equipment to razor blades and wire cutters for aiding in escapes. So this memoir's account left me utterly astonished and skeptical. I'm a historian of Majdanek, which is why I was given a copy of the memoir. There was a Countess Suchodolska who did perform resistance and relief activities at Majdanek, but none of the sources or accounts of former prisoners and co-workers I could find gave any indication that she was using an alias, much less that she was a Jew. I also knew that Lublin was the headquarters of Operation Reinhardt, the largest mass murder operation of the Holocaust. The SS murdered most of the 1.7 million Jewish victims in the gas chambers of the killing centers at Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. But 63,000 were murdered in the gas chambers and shooting pits at Majdanek. In this aerial photo, you see in the upper right, the prisoner compound that was marked Field 1 in the previous slide, and across from it, a U-shaped building. That's where the gas chambers were housed. Every time Janina brought her deliveries into the camp, she came down that road at the top and past that building. And according to her memoir, she knew what was happening to the prison, to the Jews in that place. So the claim that as a Jewish woman, she dared to enter this den of mass death almost daily and to smuggle contraband under the very noses of the SS seemed to me almost too fantastic to be true. I couldn't use the memoir without verifying it, and I had no way to do that. Both she and her husband had died many years before, and they had no children. I didn't have a possibility of going to Poland to do research, and anyway, I don't know Polish. I did know that there were copies of the memoir in at least 2 archives, so I figured some other historian with the right skill set would find it and bring it to light. But years, then decades passed. I never forgot this woman whom I came to think of as Janina. I was haunted by her because if her story was true, it was really important and needed to be told. Was that my responsibility? In 2017, I began really digging into who she was. I didn't have much to start with because Janina's memoir provides no identifying data. But the memoir does include a preface written after her death by Janina's husband, the brilliant philosopher of physics, Pepi Mehlberg. From that, I assumed that she was born Janina Spinner in 1915. But then I obtained 2 photos from 1925 showing Henry with his fellow philosophy students. A woman appears in each one, identified in one as Pepi Spinner and in the other as Josefa Mehlberg. This clearly had to be Janina Mehlberg, and she clearly was not 10 years old, which she would have been if she'd been born in 1915. With the help of 3 Polish scholars, I found that she was born Pepi Spinner in 1905. And then I found a reference in a 1975 book review that made me think that Janina possibly was Countess Suchodolska. That's when I sent the memoir to Joanna, whom I only knew by reputation as an expert on the Holocaust in Poland. Once she read the memoir, she offered to partner with me in investigating its claims.
Joanna, you're on mute.
Okay, I did not see this. All right. So this book is the product of detective work to trace the history of a woman whose very survival depended on covering her tracks. One of my first steps was to check the records of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research in New York. And there I found a reference to a refugee file on Henry Mehlberg. But those refugee files are not open to researchers. Luckily, the archivist recognized the importance of the story, and he agreed to grant us access to it. The file contains Henry's correspondence with various Jewish organizations in 1949. Henry wrote those letters from Canada, where he managed to obtain an academic fellowship. He was begging for help to get his wife, Pepi Mehlberg, out of communist Poland. There was a catch. She was living there under the alias of Janina Suchodolska. Now, this was the confirmation that Barry and I needed that Janina was the Countess Suchodolska who aided prisoners at Majdanek. At that point, we redoubled our efforts to find out all we could about Janina. We found out that Janina grew up in a small town in the multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual borderlands in what today is Ukraine. This area used to be part of Poland between the two world wars. And you see here on the map, Janina's hometown, where she was born, Żurawno, marked on the map, of course, with contemporary borders, today's borders. Janina's father was a wealthy landowner who mingled with the Polish nobility. This upbringing that Janina received allowed her to absorb the languages, the mannerisms, and the customs of the upper classes. We also discovered that Janina was very gifted in math. In the 1920s, she obtained a master's degree in math, studying under two of Europe's leading mathematicians at the time at the prestigious University in Lviv, today Lviv, Ukraine. However, Janina found it almost impossible as a woman to get a PhD in math. So she studied instead under a philosopher at the university, and you see him, that philosopher here in the center of the photograph, who welcomed mathematicians and scientists, as well as women and Jews among his students. And you see Janina here, of course, marked with the blue arrow. And it was at the university that Janina met her future husband, Henry. Janina obtained a PhD in philosophy at the age of 22. Then she spent a year studying in Paris. And you see here a photograph of her taken in the 1930s. After she returned to Poland, she changed her first name to the more sophisticated sounding Józefa. She and Henry married in 1933. They settled in Lviv, where they had teaching positions, and they were very active in the city's intellectual circles. And then September 1939 happened. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union divided Poland between them. And as you can see here, Lvov under the Soviets fell to the Soviet Union. The Mehlbergs survived the terror of communist rule, only to face far worse when German forces seized Lvov at the end of June 1941. And from that moment, Janina and Henry faced constant threat of violence and murder. When the Germans ordered the more than 100,000 Jews in Lviv to move into a ghetto, the Mehlbergs understood that death awaited them there. Janina's family friend came to the Mehlbergs' rescue. Count Andrzej Skrzynski arrived in Lviv on the first civilian train from Lublin. He assured the Mehlbergs that if they traveled back to Lublin with him, he would get them false identity papers as Polish Christians. And on this photograph here, you see the Count Skrzynski many years after the war. So this tells us he did survive the war. The Mehlbergs' journey took them to Lublin was a dangerous one because as Jews, they could not use public transportation. And yet, Skrzynski's smuggling mission was successful until it almost wasn't. At the train station in Lublin, a German policeman detained Henry, saying that Henry broke a baggage regulation. Janina sprang into action. She mustered all her courage to confront the policeman and insist that he release Henry. Her ruse worked. It was that incident that enabled Janina's reinvention into the Countess. The situation taught her the secret for dealing with Nazi officials. Stay cool and composed and never betray any sign of fear.
Through his contacts with the Polish resistance, Skrzynski obtained false identity papers for the Mehlbergs as Countess Janina and Count Piotr Suchodolski. But Janina quickly realized that even as supposed ethnic Poles, she and Henry were still not safe. The Gestapo were continually seizing Polish men to take them off for forced labor, often to Germany. If Henry were taken, a physical exam would immediately reveal that he was a Jew, condemning them both. In March 1942, Janina, along with all the residents of Lublin, observed the start of Operation Reinhardt with the very bloody deportation action that sent 28,000 Jews from the Lublin ghetto to Belzec. Within just a few weeks, Poles living near Belzec were reporting that all of the thousands of Jews being sent daily to Belzec were being murdered there. Janina realized that she and Henry were probably not going to survive much longer. And she decided enough with living in fear and trying to figure out how to survive. I need to figure out how to live the rest of my life. And she decided to devote whatever time she had left to resisting her country's occupiers and rescuing her compatriots. Count Skrzynski sponsored Janina's acceptance into the Polish Home Army. This was the military wing of the Polish underground state. Skrzynski was also the top official in Lublin district of the Main Welfare Council, which was known by its initials RGO. This organization was allowed to provide relief by the Germans only to ethnic Poles. Separate organizations were set up to help Polish Jews and Polish Ukrainians. The RGO ran soup kitchens, orphanages, and clinics, supplied food and medicines for Poles in prisons and forced labor camps, and found shelter for the victims of ethnic cleansing campaigns. Skrzynski hired Janina to serve as his right hand in the RGO. In 1943, the SS gave RGO permission to supply food and medicines for Polish prisoners at Majdanek. Skrzynski immediately put Janina in charge of this program. Her memoir reveals her passionate dedication to do all that she could to help Majdanek's prisoners, no matter the risk to herself. Her goal was to provide enough food to benefit all of the prisoners at Majdanek, including the Jews. I'm going to read an excerpt now that gives a sense of how Janina dealt with Nazi officials. This is based on her memoir, and describes her first meeting in May 1944 with Majdanek's new commandant. He was Arthur Liebehenschel, previously the commandant of Auschwitz and the #2 official in the entire concentration camp system. But then he got into trouble and was sent off to command Majdanek at a time when Soviet forces were already closing in on Lublin and many of the prisoners had been evacuated. He immediately barred the delivery of any aid for the remaining prisoners and vowed to arrest any RGO employee who attempted to enter the camp. But Janina insisted on meeting with him. When she entered his office, she found Liebehenschel standing at a window with his back to her. He refused to acknowledge her when she greeted him. Acting as if the situation were perfectly natural, Janina began explaining the purpose of her visit. Suddenly, the commandant erupted. "What do you think you're doing here?" he screamed, still facing the window. "Do you imagine this is a sanitarium for bandits and enemies of our country? Is that why you keep coming here as if it were a drawing room or something? Feeding these criminals as if they were the most precious people on earth. This is sheer Polish insolence. Don't you know that this is a concentration camp? Do you think it is a mess hall for gentlemen? You and your committee," he spat. "We should look into your activities. We should investigate all of you, including your precious charges. Those darlings that you are feeding with such dedication. Why, they look much better off than our soldiers. They're healthy and strong, don't do a stitch of work all day long, and are being fed like princes." Janina was all too familiar with such tantrums from German officials. After Liebehenschel's tirade ended, she moved to the other window in the office and, with her back to him, calmly continued. "We are an institution approved by the German authorities to care for the needy among the Polish population, and whatever we have done in Majdanek has been with the agreement of the camp administration." "Not anymore," Liebehenschel barked. Janina was not about to back down. "Perhaps if there is no need for soup now, we could just send some packages," she suggested reasonably. "You Polacks!" he shrieked, expressing all of his scorn and loathing in the pejorative term. "We throw you out one door and presto, you come in by another." Then, nonplussed by Janina's cool persistence, he shouted, "I can't hear what you're mumbling there. You're talking to the window." Janina turned. "And I don't hear you too well either, Herr Kommandant, and perhaps that is why we can't seem to come to an understanding." At that, Liebehenschel turned to face her for the first time, and after studying her for a moment, gestured for her to sit down. Janina proceeded to explain to the commandant how the RGO's help would be to his advantage as well. "You have said yourself," she pointed out, "that people still here were kept to maintain order in the camp. You surely realize that well-fed workers are more efficient than underfed ones. If you consider soup superfluous, I won't insist on it. I could provide packages instead." He gave up and said gruffly, "Packages all right, but no luxuries." In July 1944, the Red Army drove the Germans out of Lublin. The Soviet secret police immediately began hunting down members of the anti-communist Polish Home Army, while Lublin's new communist rulers accused the RGO of collaborating with the Germans. Shkrinsky had to flee Lublin. But the new government also still needed the RGO's services, and so it asked Janina to stay on. She decided it was too dangerous for her to reveal her true identity, and so she became Dr. Janina Suchodolska, social worker, and she quickly rose to be the deputy director of Poland's National Social Welfare Agency. Henry, though, longed to return to his academic career, so he did revert to his pre-war identity and got a teaching position at a Polish university. He learned that most of his family had been murdered in the Holocaust, except for 2 brothers and their wives. You can see them all here gathered in Warsaw not long after the war. Soon, though, anti-Semitic violence in Poland would persuade them all that they needed to find a way to flee the country. In her work, Janina had contacts with foreign and international aid organizations. She used them to get a UN fellowship to tour the United States. Local newspapers reported on the visit of this woman who was a high official from a communist country. The purpose of Janina's fellowship was to study child welfare services, but her goal was to make contacts with US scholars who might be able to get Henry an appointment in the West. This is how Henry managed to go to Canada in 1949. It took nearly a year and a half, but somehow Janina managed to flee Poland. She showed up in the British occupation sector of Berlin and defected. In October 1950, she joined Henry in Canada, now as Dr. Josephine Janina Bednarski Mehlberg, mathematician, born in 1915. You can see her here shortly after she got to Canada, enjoying her newfound freedom. In 1956, the Mehlbergs emigrated to the US so that Henry could take an academic appointment at the University of Chicago. Janina got a position as a mathematician as well, and in the 1960s became a fully tenured mathematics professor at Illinois Institute of Technology, also in Chicago. That's where you see her teaching here. This was an extremely unusual position for a woman at that time. Janina did not tell her new friends what she did during the war. Some didn't even know that she was Jewish. Not long before she died in 1969, though, she recorded on paper some aspects of her life between 1939 and 1944. After her death, Henry translated this memoir into English and tried without success to get it published.
Janina's memoir is an invaluable testimony of one woman's survival during the Holocaust. From it, we learn about how her rescue was arranged and how she, in turn, arranged the rescue of others. Janina witnessed the beginning and end of the largest mass murder operation of the Holocaust. But her memoir also testifies to the suffering and persecution of non-Jewish Poles under German occupation. The Nazis viewed ethnic Poles as subhuman racial enemies, and they planned to eliminate most of them from Europe after winning the war. The Germans pursued their anti-Polish policy with brutality and determination. They destroyed and looted Polish national and cultural treasures. They shot members of the Polish intelligentsia. They put millions of Poles to forced labor, and they conducted bloody ethnic cleansing and reprisal campaigns. And on these photographs here on this slide, you see documentation from the various ways in which Poles were persecuted. So the German occupation of Poland cost the lives of 3 million Polish Jews and of nearly 2 million non-Jewish Poles. Through our research, we discovered that Janina's accomplishments were even more astonishing than what she claimed in her memoir. For example, here is a part of a report that Janina filed as Countess Suchodolska about her efforts in the summer of 1943 to win the release of thousands of Poles from Majdanek. These were prisoners who were peasants who had been seized in a brutal ethnic cleansing campaign. The SS quickly sent the able-bodied adults off for forced labor, and they dumped the rest, mostly children and the infirm, in Majdanek. These people were rapidly dying from horrific conditions. So Janina, through her various efforts, won the agreement of the SS to release 3,600 of those Polish peasants into her organization's care. But in the end, around 2,100 were released, and nearly 200 of those released died within days, and half of them were children. Janina makes no mention of this in her memoir, of winning the release of these peasants from Majdanek, or most of the other prisoner releases that she won by negotiating with the Germans. Based just on wartime records, we documented that Janina negotiated the release from German captivity of over 9,700 Poles. Now, this is what is documented, but it's impossible to estimate how many more survived because of her relief and resistance efforts. By comparison, Oskar Schindler is, of course, rightfully honored for saving the lives of 1,200 of his workers. Schindler, of course, was a non-Jew who rescued Jews. Janina, on the other hand, was a Jew who rescued thousands of non-Jews. And she did that by negotiating face-to-face with Nazi officials who were determined to murder people like her. So here, you can see some of the officials that Janina dealt with. I'd like to draw your attention to one man here. The name right here, his photograph, Hermann Hoffel. He was the official who helped Janina obtain the release of prisoners from Majdanek in 1943. This man was also the manager of Operation Reinhard. So when he was helping Janina, he already had the blood of over 1.5 million Jews on his hands.
Our original plan had been to publish the memoir with some explanatory text. Then we found that the memoir doesn't do justice to what Janina accomplished during the war, and that her life before and after the war was pretty remarkable too. So we have written her biography instead. But in doing that, we've had the advantage of her wonderful memoir, which allows us to tell her story in part from her perspective, incorporating her thoughts and observations, even the conversations she recounted, like the one I read earlier with Liebehenschel. There are many vivid and riveting scenes in the memoir. Just a few examples include when she rescued Henry from a mass shooting, and the 2 times she narrowly escaped arrest by the Gestapo. Janina's memoir testifies not just to what she did and witnessed, though, but also to what she learned about human nature from observing it in the midst of the horrors of occupied Poland. She wrote about enemies who she knew were perpetrating terrible crimes, and yet who took risks to help, even save her. And she wrote about Poles who were both courageous and venal, self-sacrificing and hateful. She found that she couldn't predict whether someone would help or harm her in any given situation based only on that person's ethnicity, religion, or ideology. She also testified very movingly to the terrible choices that the occupation forced people to make between staying true to their values and survival, often for their families as well as themselves. And so she decided not to judge what people did to survive, but simply approached each person as a fellow member of what she called the vast suffering human family. And if they were suffering, then she considered it her human duty to relieve their suffering.
Like Janina, many, even most Holocaust survivors did not talk about their experiences for the first decades after the war. For some, it was too traumatic to revisit the horrors that they had suffered. But many also assumed, with some justification, that no one wanted to hear their stories. Ignorance of Holocaust victims' experiences fed misconceptions, especially that the Jews reacted passively to Nazi persecution, that they went like sheep to the slaughter. But the efforts of recent decades to collect and make public the stories of Holocaust survivors have exposed that misconception as a lie. Historians now recognize that Jewish armed resistance to the Nazis was far more widespread than previously known, and that Jewish resistance took many other forms as well. And the survivors' stories reveal that Jews reacted to the Nazis' genocidal plans with defiance, ingenuity, courage, and heroism. Barry and I are professional Holocaust historians, In the course of our respective work, we have reviewed probably thousands of Holocaust victims' diaries, memoirs, testimonies, and oral histories. We have never come across a story like Janina's. Then again, the story of every Holocaust victim is unique. Their stories reveal the terror, horror, and almost unimaginable suffering that Jews had to endure. But they are also stories of family, faith, resistance, and resilience. We need these stories. They remind us of our common humanity with the 6 million. They show us the danger that we all face when we fail to confront hate and protect the dignity of every human. And they show us the power of individuals to make a difference. What motivated Janina to risk her life for others, to go into Majdanek day after day, knowing that she would be gruesomely tortured and murdered if her resistance activities or her Jewish identity were discovered? Henry, her husband, explained Janina's motive in mathematical terms. Janina, he wrote, and I quote, started with a prime value, the saving of as many lives as possible, and proceeding to weigh as impersonally as possible the value of her own life against the number at stake. She based her action on the higher probability. One life was worth less than many. Against this probability rate, she operated for years, under Nazi rule and under Soviet, repeatedly risking death and the worst that might prelude it, because the help she could give to others demanded the chance. Indeed, she could see no meaning in her life unless she risked. Personal safety was only the agent to secure further service to those who knew no safety. If it were only for its own sake, for nothing but personal comfort and survival, how ephemeral it was, how worthless in even the short run. She would not survive, if she would survive, having watched out for herself and her own only. It would not have been worth it. She might die, and many times knew this might be the moment, but not for nothing, not to live uselessly, nor to die pointlessly. Acting on the principle that one life has a lesser value than multiple lives, Janina saved thousands, and in the process, she proved the value of one. Barry and I believe that her story deserves to be told throughout the world because the world needs such stories. Thank you very much for your attention, for coming to this program and for learning about Janina Mehlberg's story. We would love for you to stay in touch with us. Here you can see we have 3 websites. The first one is for about our book, and here's the code that you can scan. We also have individual professional websites. Please get in touch with us if you have questions. Please get in touch with us if you would like to host a program with us. So thank you very much. And I turn it over to Jonathan, I'm sorry.
Thank you so much. That really was a remarkable summary. And I think what was very interesting about your presentation for me, having read your book, is how relatively little you focused on the detail of the work Janina did, which actually takes up a considerable amount of the book. It really is worth reading to understand sort of day by day what she did manage to do. Why do you think it's taken so long for this story to reach the light of day?
Well, nobody knew about it, so she didn't talk about it after the war. And she wrote this memoir, but there wasn't really any interest in and publishers. Henry tried to get it published, and then another historian that he gave it to before he died tried to get it published as well. And one of the things he did was to send it to a very eminent Holocaust historian in the US. And he read it and said, well, it's an interesting story, but really the experiences of one woman Holocaust survivor don't make a compelling case for publication. So this was in the 80s when Holocaust studies is just in its infancy, and the focus of the field was really on the perpetrators. Since then, the focus has widened considerably, and the experiences of Holocaust victims and survivors has a much bigger role. There's much more interest in that now, and particularly in the experiences of Jewish women in the Holocaust. But still, nobody knew about the memoir except for me and the historian who gave it to me, who died in 2007. So it took a lot of work to verify that it was true. I mean, it tells such an incredible story that it just was not possible for me as a historian to take it on face value.
Just a reminder to our audience, please do type your questions into the Q&A facility in the time we have left. I would love to put your questions to Barry and Joanna. I was interested in the comment you made about the scholars who had helped you to identify Janina. Can you talk in a bit more detail about that? What exactly were they able to do that you couldn't do through your own research, and how were they able to prove that this indeed was the person you were looking for?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the first things I did when I was digging into who she was to track down a former student of Henry's at the University of Chicago, Arthur Fine, who was also a philosopher of physics. And he put me in touch with a philosophy scholar in Poland, Jan Walensky, who has written about the Warsaw School of Philosophy and Logic, which both Henry and Janina, I didn't know Janina at that time belonged to it, but she did. And so he sent me a photo of Henry with his fellow philosophy students in 1925 with a woman named Pepi Mehlberg. And then he got in touch with another scholar who'd written on the school, and he sent me a different photo showing the same woman as Pepi Mehlberg. Mm. And then his PhD student dug up her dissertation, and that's where I found that she was born Pepi Mehlberg in 1905. But as Joanna explained, the proof that we found that she was Janina Suchodolska, the definitive proof was in the Henry's refugee file at Riga. And then subsequently, we were able to find photographs, like the photographs in the US newspapers of Janina Suchodolska, that provided the visual proof that she was Janina Mehlberg.
Fascinating. We have a question from Michael Bell. He's interested to know a little bit more about how you came across the memoir. And he asks, when did she write it? And what do you think motivated her to write it?
Oh, great questions. So in 1989, I was working for the Justice Department investigating concentration camp guards, including some who had served at Majdanek. And I got very fascinated by Majdanek and how different it was from the other concentration camps. So I delivered a paper on it at the American Historical Association convention. And there, the historian to whom Henry had given the memoir gave me the carbon copy on onion skin paper. So that's how it started. She wrote it based on references in the memoir. We believe that she wrote it after 1962. She died in 1969. And we think that her motive for writing it was to counter a very anti-Semitic interpretation narrative of the Holocaust that was being furthered by the Polish government at the time, which was engaged in a very anti-Semitic campaign, anti-Zionist, as they called it. And according to this narrative, the Jews were cowardly, passive, went like sheep to the slaughter. All of the non-Jewish Poles tried their best to save the Jews, and now they were only being answered by the Jews who survived with accusations that they had collaborated. So the Jews were ungrateful and cowardly. And so she wrote this memoir, which shows that she was a Jew and a Polish patriot. She was rescued by a Jew and by a non-Jewish Pole, and she rescued non-Jewish Poles. And she risked her life for her country. She was not passive. She was a patriot.
How close did she come to being caught? And I think there are two levels to being caught, aren't there? There's the level of being caught as a Polish woman who was being subversive to the Nazi regime, which it seems she was fairly close to being once or twice. But there was also the possibility of being caught for who she really was. And the impression I got was that that was really not there at all. The risk to her seemed to be being caught to be part of the Polish underground. Is that right, or was there a real risk she could have been discovered for her true identity?
Well, that is an excellent question. And yes, there was always a risk for her of being discovered as a Jewish woman living under a false identity. She had false papers under an assumed name in order to have a valid identification that was approved, checked, verified, and approved by the German authorities. She had to submit documentation. We don't know. She doesn't talk about, she didn't write about it in her memoir. We have no one to ask about this. We don't know how she was able to pass the verification process. But she was not, from what we understand from the memoir, there wasn't a situation where she would be identified as a Jewish woman. She so perfect, basically so perfect were her acting skills, and the fact that she assumed this false persona of a Polish Catholic and an aristocratic woman at that. So that's, you're right, Jonathan, there's one level of this. And the other one is about there was more risk of her being caught because of her activities in the resistance, because, as Barry mentioned in the presentation, Janina was involved not only in providing the approved items, products, food products into Majdanek, but she used those opportunities to smuggle in messages, smuggle in razor blades, smuggle in other contraband, and to smuggle out messages from the camp that detail, what was going on in the camp. In fact, Janina's activities facilitated creating a resistance, a Polish resistance group inside Majdanek. So this was considered dangerous to the Germans. And throughout the time that Janina entered Majdanek to bring relief to Polish prisoners, some of the camp guards, the German authorities, suspected that she was doing something covert. And there are many instances that we describe in the book of these kinds of close calls, right? That Janina, as you've seen, Janina was almost discovered, right? And she had this grand escape in which some of her colleagues from the RGO, from the main welfare council that she worked for, had aided her to escape, jump on this track on a truck, and then go to safety and wait out until they found out, if the Germans who came into the office were really looking for her, if they were going to arrest her, and so on. So there are several close calls throughout the book, including one that Janina would have been for sure revealed as a member of the resistance when she aided in the planned escape of Majdanek prisoners. So Majdanek prisoners were being transferred in spring of 1944, were being transferred to other camps. And the plan of the Polish resistance was to arrange for an escape of at least some number of those prisoners. And Janina brought in razor blades, alcohol to spike the drinks of the Germans, some medicine to put the Germans to kind of like to sleep basically, so that the prisoners could escape. And she knew that what if the plot was successful, she would be suspected and accused even of having aided in this escape, and that would spell certain death. So there are many instances, and I encourage everyone in the audience to have a read and learn how these situations unfolded.
There was something quite interesting about Florstedt, who was the commandant of the camp at one point. Interestingly, you talk about how he just disappears, and we don't know whether he survived the war or not. But his career fell over because the mortality rate in his camp was too high. And this seems to be completely counterintuitive, to keep people in those conditions and yet expect that they're not going to die. What was that all about?
Yes, well, for a long time, the concentration camps, the purpose was to destroy the prisoners through labor. But then by late 42 and early 43, especially after the Battle of Stalingrad, it was clear Germany was not on the verge of winning the war, and victory was questionable. And so the Germans needed to send all the able-bodied men to the front, and they needed workers to replace them. And Poland is one place where they looked for workers, especially Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS and of the concentration camp system. And so then the problem, though, with that, he saw his concentration camp population as a captive workforce that he could use to actually increase his standing in the German regime and have a role in the war economy. But the problem was that the prisoners were dying very, very rapid rates. And so by early 43, there were orders out to take measures to reduce the mortality of prisoners at concentration camps. And in late summer of 1943, a study came out that showed that Majdanek had by far the highest prisoner mortality rate of all the other concentration camps, including Auschwitz. And so that was one reason Florstedt got into trouble. It also didn't help that he had been pilfering the valuables of the Jewish victims of Majdanek, which was not that stealing their valuables was wrong to the SS, but not turning it over to the SS was wrong.
Interesting. Obviously, Janina will have been aware of what was happening to the Jews in Majdanek, and she seems not to even attempt to help. The impression one gets is that she realizes this is a futile approach, and really the only people she can help are the Poles. But she says something at the end of the memoir which is quite interesting, and it's this point you mentioned earlier about none of us has the right to sit in judgment of the people who did whatever they did at that time. But in amongst those words, she says, "We risked our necks." And it looked to me almost like she's saying, "Don't judge me." It's very much written about don't judge other people, but this little line about we risked our necks just said to me, hang on, this lady is saying don't judge me. And I wonder if her entire strategy and all the amazing good things she did was in fact a means of survival for her, that by becoming more and more and more engrossed in this work, she actually had a better chance of surviving the war, because the more she did it, the less she would have the chance to be uncovered, I suppose. The more real it would become. Do you get what I'm saying?
Yes, I think you make a very interesting point that in a way what Janina was doing, saving non-Jewish Poles, allowed her to survive in a way that she found a purpose in her while she herself was trying to survive, right? That kind of maybe diverted her attention from herself, and if she would only focus on the suffering that she would have to endure, and that her family, her relatives, her friends were going through, and instead she directed all her energy, all her focus on saving those people whom she could, the non-Jewish Poles. Now, she couldn't help Jews for a few reasons. One was when she arrived in Lublin in December 1941, all the Jews of Lublin had been confined to a ghetto for 9 months already. And she had no connections in Lublin. She had no relatives, no friends, no one. And she and her husband, Henry, were living with 2 aristocratic women. So they couldn't, the Mehlbergs could not, take in another Jewish person and hide that person in their apartment. So that's one reason. But Janina really truly believed that the products that she was bringing into Majdanek in the form of food and medicine, that would eventually also help the Jewish prisoners. And she had high hopes for that. But then November 1943 happened, Operation Harvest Festival, where thousands of Jews, where the SS murdered, shot to death thousands of Jews in Majdanek. And with that, all of Janina's hopes of helping Jewish prisoners in the camp were eliminated.
We have a couple of questions from our audience, which I think you'll be able to answer quite quickly. Firstly, is there still material to discover on this woman, particularly about her relationship with the Soviet authorities, perhaps before she left for Canada? And we have another question: did any of her family survive the Holocaust?
Sure. So in terms of material, Barry and I are very much fascinated with the story, and opportunities such as this program with Milim offers us the chance to share Janina's story. And perhaps there is someone in the audience, there is someone who has a connection to the story who can share more information with us. But even as we were finishing our manuscript, we were continuing to do research, and we connected with Janina's relatives of her, her husband's relatives, but let's say extended family members. And one of them was a niece, Henry's niece, who lived with the Mehlbergs in Chicago, and she confirmed some of the information that we had. And it was news to her to learn about the details of this story. There's also information in Polish archives that we would love to see, that we haven't been able to access, and that does involve Janina's work and life under Soviet rule in Poland. Because she worked for the Polish authorities, there were tabs kept on her. There must have been someone following her, checking, from the Secret Service about her contacts and kind of what she was doing in the States, what she was doing in Poland. But we were not able to access that information.
So there might be more to come. This book is available from all good booksellers. It's a really, really excellent read. Thank you so much to both of you for being our guests this evening. And as a million thank you, I'm going to send you some of my photographs of Faces of Israel, which might take a little while to reach you, but we'll get to you sooner or later. And I very much hope you'll enjoy them. The book is available from all good booksellers. Now, a few words about our upcoming programme before we leave you. We're off next Monday for the bank holiday, but back on the 2nd of September with Roger Morehouse, and he'll be speaking about his book, The Forgers, which concerns the rescue of Jews during the Holocaust using fake Latin American passports. This is something Danny Finkelstein spoke about a little bit when he was our guest, for those of you who attended the talk with him or watched it online. And the following week, we welcome Rachel Cockerill, who will be speaking to me about her book, Melting Pot, which is a uniquely written family history. We have much more in the pipeline, so do visit the website milim.org.uk for details about what we have to come and for recordings of past events, and also to sign up to our newsletter to make sure that you don't miss anything. All of our online events are free. You can, if you wish, donate to help with the costs of putting on our programme. There's a link in the chat, or you'll also find details on the website. Now, we are thinking about running an event about poetry, and we're interested to know what you think about that. So look out in our next newsletter. We're going to run a poll, and hopefully you will be very enthusiastic, and we've got some poets lined up to speak to you about their work and recite their poetry. So it remains for me to thank our guests, Barry White and Joanna Sliwa. Thank you so much to both of you. And looking forward to seeing all of you at a future event. Until then, stay safe. See you soon.
Thank you. Thank you so much.